following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back talking vintage sports in the zone. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I have a panel that cannot be beat. David Hubler is here. How are you, David?
I'm fine, thank you.
Alan Blumkin is here.
Hello there, everybody.
All right, Alan, and we have Hal Bock. How you doing,
Hi,
Hal?
everybody. Hi, everybody.
And George Case III. Now, I'm going to turn it over first to David Hubler. He's got something to say, and he's going to give it, after he says his piece, he's going to give it over to George Case III, who has a very special guest for us. And I'd like to, at this point, turn it over to David Hubler.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. Listen, anybody who's followed this show knows what we old-timers think of all this fan graphics and stats and all this stuff. But I came across a very brief paragraph today, I think it was in the New York Post, talking about Gary Sanchez and how he'd improved his catching on the Yankees this season. And the paragraph reads, now just listen carefully, the paragraph reads, quote, while Sanchez improved on the defensive flaws that were obvious to fans, which most analytically driven front offices do not care about, he regressed in the art of framing pitches. His now initial caps, his framing runs above average rate went from 2.6 in 2018 to a minus 6.8 according to Fangraphics. His defensive value, according to that site, dropped from 8.9 to minus 0.1 this season. Can anyone tell me what that means?
Oh. I absolutely never heard of such a thing, David. Thank you for bringing it up.
I just I couldn't let it pass because we've talked about all those crazy stats, and this one just,
Well,
the art
before
of
you turn it over to George,
yeah.
I'll just say, does anybody care what it means?
No.
Let alone know what it means.
No, probably not. Certainly not the fans.
Not
us.
Not
us, right.
Us old guys, we'd rather say, hey, you know what, catcher, you didn't do a very good job behind the plate, period.
But and that was the point, that he was a much improved defensive catcher this past year, not according to Fangraphics. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over now to George Case III, who knows all about this Fangraphics stuff. George, you're...
Well, yeah. Hey, thank you very much, David. It's very enjoyable for me to hear a stat like that because I have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. And I'm sure Mark, our guest tonight is Mark Millikin, who's an author, has written a wonderful book about Jimmie Foxx, and we're going to really talk about the life and times of Jimmie Foxx with Mark. And I'm sure that when Jimmie was playing, and Jimmie was a catcher sometime during his career, or at various times, I'm sure nobody ever talked to him about how he frames the pitch statistically. You're behind the plate, you're setting up the location for the pitcher, and that's what you do. And, I have no idea what this latest stat that David mentioned, which I think is really interesting. I have no idea what that means. But, Mark, that's sort of beside the point. I want to welcome you to our podcast. And if you could, I would like to talk a little bit about you to begin with, your interest in Jimmie Foxx, your interest in baseball, because I know your profession had been, I'm not sure whether you're retired or still doing it, you were involved in the fisheries management business, I believe, at one time.
Yes, thank you, George. I was with NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service as a biologist and a fishery manager for quite a few years, from 1974 to 2011. And then I did it again a couple times as a part-timer, a consultant since then. But born in 51 and born in Baltimore, we moved to Boston in 1957 for the next 5 years. And the reason I mention that is that that's where I kind of got started with Jimmie Foxx a little bit, because So here we go. It's 1961-ish. Fleer baseball cards are coming out 2 years in a row with Hall of Famer type players. I guess they couldn't sign the current players because Topps had a monopoly or something. But I'm following Ted Williams in 58 and 59 and 60 as he's winding down, and still had that fantastic season actually in 1957 when I was barely able to appreciate it. But going to the ballpark at Fenway a couple times. Here I am a Baltimorean, but I got my start in Boston with baseball. I'm seeing the Red Sox scorebook saying that Jimmie Foxx holds the record for a single season for home runs and runs batted in for a Red Sox player. And I'm thinking, Jimmie Foxx? What about Ted Williams? What's going on here? And the numbers were so large, the 50 home runs, the 175 runs batted in, that I was really impressed. And then, the Sporting News had their annual books with all their stats. Most of us back then were we ourselves are playing Little League Baseball. And that's where I got my start with Jimmie Foxx. And it just grew as time went on, as I became a teenager living back in Maryland again. Not to ramble on too much, but I was wondering early on when I found out he was born in Sudlersville, Maryland, I thought, well, gee, where's Sudlersville? Does it still exist? Back then, as we all know, we couldn't go to Google. That wasn't until 1998. We couldn't go with a few taps of the finger to a computer or a device and look up all this information. So we had to find it out in bits and pieces over time. But my interest in Jimmie Foxx grew as I realized he was from my native state of Maryland. And, I could go on and on. But that's my start to trying to answer your question about the fisheries end of it. But then the baseball part of it was all along.
Well, Mark, I wanted to ask you this. You were very gracious to send me your book, and it's called Jimmie Foxx, The Pride of Sudlersville. Now, you had also mentioned to me, and I had received some information, I think they're trying to establish a larger museum or something like that in Sudlersville in honor of Jimmie Foxx. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and then I want to ask you a little bit more about the baseball card situation and the Red Sox, because I know a little bit about it, and Jimmy and my dad were very friendly. But I'd like you to talk a little bit, if you would, Mark, a little bit about, Sudlersville itself, and with Jimmy being the favored son of that little town.
Right. Well, George, in Jimmy's time, or when he was born, around 1910, not long after he was born, in 1920, that time period, there were only 220 or 230 people living in Sudlersville on the eastern shore of Maryland, Queen Anne's County, and they currently only have 480 people. Now, they have their own town library, not even part of the county, Queen Anne's County. It's been there since roughly 1910, I think. It's a wonderful library. They have a train station that Jimmy himself used, so to speak, to catch the train a few times to spring training or up to Philadelphia many years ago. They have a train station that has been renovated. It houses a lot of artifacts for the town and the county, and also a lot of Jimmie Foxx material. And they have quite a bit of money for starting, but they need extra money to actually do the final enlargement and renovation of it to house the additional materials they have at that train station. And Loretta Walls has done a lot through the years to keep Jimmie Foxx's memory alive. The biggest thing she did was in 1997, George. She spearheaded the drive to have a life-size bronze statue of Jimmy erected in the center of town, just a couple years after Chestertown, Maryland, had done the same for Bill Nicholson. So that's generally what's going on there. If you need specifics now or at any point near the end of the the broadcast, I can give you, a couple ways to help out, or just contact Loretta Walls herself and ask what are some options of ways your listeners or somebody could help out.
Well, Mark, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the statue. Is that statue of Jimmie Foxx what you have on the cover of your book?
Yes, it is. Okay.
Now, where is that? Is that in the center of Sudlersville, or is there an identity in the town that, this is where the great, Jimmie Foxx was born and lived and so forth?
It's at the intersection of routes 300 and 313, which literally is the center of Sudlersville.
Right.
It's at one of those pieces right at the traffic light. You could step out of any one of those four directions you're coming and get out of the car, and you'd be at the statue within a matter of a minute or two. Not even that. It's real close to the traffic light.
Right. Well, I think it's a very good likeness of Jimmie. I mean, I've seen a lot of photos of Jimmie. I'm sure that Alan and Hal and David, and I mean, Jimmie is a very well-known figure. Although I believe in annals of baseball history, he's sometimes overlooked. I mean, he was a superstar, and a lot of people have talked to me about Jimmie Foxx, and they write his name Jimmy, and I have to tell them right off the bat. I said, Jimmie Foxx, as far as I know, always signed his name. And Alan, you might have some baseball cards, Jimmy. That's how he spelled, his first name.
I think it was Jimmie.
Right, it's Jimmie, right?
Yeah.
Jimmie rather than Jimmy, which is what a lot of people will spell the first name Jimmie, but Jimmie Foxx always spelled it with an IE.
Very underrated player.
His signature on the Louisville Slugger, for one example, is the IE, and just about everywhere I've ever looked outside of Sudlersville, anything that he signed, or if he signed a postcard, it was IE. But a lot of the folks, for some reason, for a long time in Sudlersville, thought it was Jimmy, and that's where some of the confusion lies from. But a lot of the sports writers over the years in that time period, I think especially early on, spelled it Jimmy, but when he was a rookie minor leaguer, even on the Eastern Shore, certain papers were spelling his last name with one X. And Philadelphia did the same thing early in 1925 when he was first to Philadelphia A, but that was a different era.
Well, you know what, and Alan, you might want to jump in here because, Jimmie Foxx, his nickname, well, he had a couple nicknames, the Beast, but the nickname that I first remember when I was a little boy hearing my dad talk about Jimmie Foxx was Fox, Foxx, and his nickname was Double X.
Yeah, I've heard that. There was a great story that Lefty Gomez once did talk about where he was on the mound and Fox was coming up, and Bill Dickey gave him every signal, and he shook his head every time. So Dickey went out to the mound and asked Gomez, what do you want to do? He says, stand here. Maybe he'll get tired and leave.
Right.
That's a great story, and I can only tell you from my earliest recollection, my dad and Jimmie knew each other from the mid-30s. Jimmie played in an exhibition game in 1935 in Trenton. Jimmie used to come to Trenton a lot. I have photos of Jimmie fishing. I have photos of Jimmie at banquets in Trenton, and also, and this is not a commercial for the product, but he used to come to, when he was playing for the Philadelphia A's, he loved to come up to Trenton to get a supply of Case's pork roll, which is what he loved to eat. So, that's a little aside about Jimmie and baseball, but he was a real, person, extremely likable, My dad used to say there's no one who's ever disliked Jimmie Foxx. I mean, they admired his ability, obviously, but he was just a very warm, down-to-earth human being.
You know, he accumulated some remarkable statistics. I mean, he had 12 straight 30 home run seasons. He had 13 seasons with over 100 RBIs. He was a genuine slugger. But you wonder, I consider myself a pretty good baseball historian, and certainly I knew who Jimmie Foxx was. But did he not get kind of overlooked in the era of Ruth and Gehrig and those people? He had he won a Triple Crown one year. He hit 58 home runs another year and should have had 60, but got a couple of home runs rained out on him. So, he was a tremendous slugger. And yet, as you look back on that era, you know of him, and yet you don't view him, or at least I don't think many people view him, as one of the premier players of his time. And I wonder about that.
You know what, Hal? That's a very good point. I think the same way. Mark, you might want to step in here on this because Jimmie Foxx, to me, has been overlooked because he was playing in that era with Ruth and Gehrig, and Jimmie was every bit as much of a slugger as those two, except that he was playing, in Philadelphia, and then he was playing in Boston, and you had, Ruth and Gehrig, playing in New York. So his numbers, Jimmie Foxx's numbers, and you're absolutely right, Hal. In 1933, he won the American League Triple Crown. And, that's a heck of a feat and something that he should be recognized more, I believe. I've talked to people about Triple Crown winners, and I mentioned, Jimmie Foxx in 1933, and they sort of look at me like, what the hell are you talking about? So, Mark, you might want to step in there because I think that's a part of Jimmie Foxx's history in baseball that is often overlooked.
Well, I think his luster faded very quickly in the 40s and got worse, so to speak, in the 50s and the 60s. In the 30s, I should say 1929, especially on into the 30s, he was, of course, very well known while he was still playing and very well thought of. He was called the right-handed Ruth by many sports writers starting in 1929. This was because of the distance of his home runs. He was quickly, by, let's say, 1933, becoming known as having hit the longest home run in a ballpark, an American League park, for a right-handed hitter. Ruth was the longest for a left-handed hitter. He was regularly hitting his home runs farther than Gehrig, according to Bill Jenkinson, for one of the researchers that some of you probably know of. And he almost had the Triple Crown in 32, except for an anomaly in the requirements for qualifying for a batting average. Dale Alexander was able to sneak by him with 367 with not many at-bats, but Foxx almost had a Triple Crown 2 years in a row. And then, of course, even late in his career in 38 and 39 with Boston, he had some outstanding seasons there. The last one, of course, 39, being along with Ted Williams. So while he was still playing, he was well thought of. But even having said that, because his 3 World Series were all early in his career, he had a lot of national attention for those 3 years early on. That helps. But then after that, the A's were downhill from then on, and the Yankees were back on the rise. So Ruth was in a class by himself for so many reasons, his baseball ability and his personality. And Gehrig stood out because he was a fantastic, a great Yankee player, a home run hitter, maybe even a slightly better batter than Foxx. He had a consecutive game streak, and they both played in more World Series than Foxx, meaning Gehrig and Ruth. And, of course, Gehrig will always be remembered for the tragic illness and early death from the Lou Gehrig disease. So, but I still think while they were still playing, Jimmie was right up there in the eyes of the fans and the sports writers. From some of the fans I heard from when I was trying to complete the research for this book. But once the 40s and 50s came, it seemed like with every decade, the memory or the glow from his stardom, it just continued to weaken. By the time we were in the 60s and 70s, we're not hearing much about Jimmie Foxx anymore, but we're still hearing a lot about Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth and maybe a few others.
You know, another thing about Jimmie
that's
Foxx,
right. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me just point this out. Another thing about Jimmie Foxx that I never knew, I was doing a book on, I don't remember what, but I was doing the research, and I came across the Philadelphia Phillies in 1945. Now, we had a shortage of manpower because of the war, and who shows up pitching for the Philadelphia Phillies but Jimmie Foxx? And I thought, well, this has got to be wrong. Jimmie Foxx was a slugger. He was a first baseman. He played some outfield. He was a catcher. But there wasn't a pitcher. And indeed he was. He threw 22 innings, had, what did he have, a 1-something ERA. I mean, that's a remarkable athlete. He was 38 years old at the time.
Yeah, one thing that people really admired about him while his career was still ongoing was he had the opportunity, you could say, that maybe Lou Gehrig didn't have as far as versatility to show it off. But having started as a catcher, but he wasn't about to be the one that would be chosen over Mickey Cochran, who was a few years older, and I'm sure probably a better catcher anyhow. He had some catching ability, and then in 1935, for the first month of the season, Mac was looking over a new prospect and had Alex Hooks, a minor leaguer of some ability at first, and asked Fox to catch to start the season, and he did. He did fairly well. I don't remember the statistics. We could certainly find out what they are. And then in 1940, he caught for a while for Cronin when Red Sox injuries were mounting in the catching department. And then, like you say, in 1945, he pitched 22 or so innings. I think one game was a 6 or 7 inning stint against the Cincinnati Reds. Now, granted, this is 1945. It's wartime baseball, but he's getting up there in age. He's close to 38, and wow. He certainly had some versatility.
Well, Mark, you mentioned the versatility. I was going to bring it up, and Hal, I'm glad you did as well, because, Fox did. He caught, he played first base, he played third base, he played the outfield, and then, as Hal, you mentioned, that last year, I guess, was 45 when he was actually pitching. So, I mean, he could do a lot of different things, and he had that great power. I think there was one pitcher, I forget who it was, but somebody said, well, Jimmie Foxx has muscles in his hair. I mean, he wasn't lifting and doing all this weight training everybody was doing. I mean, Jimmie was just a naturally strong, very, very adaptable kind of baseball player who could play a lot of different positions and do well at all of them.
Yeah, I think he got a lot of his build. It must have been a combination of genetics and his farm work, because he was awfully strong already as a 15 and 16-year-old when he was playing for Sudlersville High and also the Queen Anne's County All-Stars. He was doing quite well against boys that were 17 and 18 years old, or I should say 16 and 17. He was 15 and 16. Back then in the county there, Queen Anne's County, I think people graduated after 11th grade. But, it reminds me of one thing that you guys might find interesting that's not going to come up in the form of a question, but I've been told that he was offered a scholarship to go to University of Maryland with Curly Bird, and that could have changed Jimmie's whole life if he had gone to college first. But who did that back then? Not many players or not many people given the choice of going to spring training down in Florida. But given his difficulty with jobs after baseball, finding a niche, it makes me wonder sometimes how his life might have been different if he would have gone to college at University of Maryland for a while.
What did he do after? What did he do after his career?
Yeah.
What did he do after his baseball career?
He was in a lot of sales jobs, but none of them seemed to last as much as a year. He really struggled with that. And you probably will recall that he was a manager for 1 year in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. And the story goes that Tom Hanks' character in A League of Our Own was based in part on Jimmie Foxx, but the women who played for Jimmie were the Fort Wayne Daisies in 1952. I've talked with quite a few of them, and there was actually a panel of them at the Babe Ruth Museum years ago, and they said, we were consulted before Hollywood came out with that movie, but they ignored what we said about Jimmie Foxx. He was not a drinker, a drunk, somebody that was terrorizing or giving us a hard time in any way, but the Tom Hanks character was a little rough on the players, apparently.
I agree with that, Mark, what you just said. I've often told people, I said that, that The League of Their Own, a very good movie, but that the character played by Tom Hanks, really was a Hollywood composite of Jimmie Foxx and Hack Wilson, and probably,
right.
More akin to Hack Wilson with regard to the heavy drinking, but Jimmie Foxx, always carried himself well as far as I know, and that just put a little Hollywood touch on a baseball film, which I complain about a lot of baseball films that have these Hollywood touches, and that just happened to be one of them.
Well, along the same lines and in the same era, I interviewed Maxine Andrews, one of the Andrews sisters, for a book that she had written. And as we were talking, she pointed out that Bette Midler movie about going overseas with the USO. I forget the name of the book of the film, but she said, that was so untrue. Because in the Bette Midler movie, there's fooling around and there's a love story and all this stuff. And she said, we were so well chaperoned that we couldn't go out on our own at night, under any circumstances. There was no way any of us could have gotten involved with one of the guys on the tour. So, that's Hollywood for you. That's how they do it.
It is. It is, David, and with baseball in particular, they've taken a lot of artistic license with some of these things. I remember that that famous scene, and I complain about it all the time in The Natural. I mean, an interesting story, but I have been around baseball in my life. I've never seen a ball, knock the lights out and they explode. I've never seen that.
Right.
Well, the worst example is the Babe with John Goodman, where he has a pinch runner meet him at first base on the day he's supposedly his last game of his career, and he's too weak to run the bases. So they have a guy run the bases for him, but the next time he's due up, he comes up and hits another home run, and this is how the movie ends. I mean, talk about.
Well, Babe Ruth has 3 terrible movies made about him, and the first time I saw the William Bendix one, my jaw dropped.
Yeah, that's a pretty bad one too. Yeah.
Oh God, that's beyond bad. I mean, but Lefty Gomez, after we landed a man on the moon, he asked whether Neil Armstrong found one of the baseballs that Fox had off of him.
Yeah,
right.
I read that, Alan. I read that. That's a funny line. Lefty Gomez had a lot of funny lines.
Oh yeah. Jimmie Foxx was Lefty Gomez was very, very impressed by Jimmie Foxx because he used him in a lot of his humor.
Right.
I mean, it was nothing vicious or anything, but that Fox had all the strength in the world, and he was very reluctant to pitch to him.
You know, Fox was one of the 5 guys that Carl Hubble struck out in succession in the 1934 All-Star game.
Yep. Yeah.
So that's the only negative I could find about him.
Well, yeah, you know what, Hal, and I'm glad you brought that up because that was a unique feat that Hubble performed in that All-Star game to strike out in succession those 5 guys, and you know, Fox was certainly one of them, and Hubble, you know, was a great pitcher, you know, screwballer, and I'm sure that, you know, that those great sluggers, you know, when it came to trying to hit Hubble, you know, they were doing the best they could, but he struck them out in succession. It was
you're talking about a guy who just came off the Triple Crown. Fox had won the Triple Crown the year before.
Absolutely, right. Yep.
Now Ruth was in his last season as a Yankee for that. He was on a big downhill slide that season, Ruth.
It would be interesting to look at Fox's the comparison between his home runs and his strikeouts compared to today's home run sluggers and their strikeout ratio.
Right.
I'm sure it's quite different.
No, I'm sure it is, David. I don't have that in front of me. Maybe Mark, you can comment on that. But I've mentioned on the air many times that the way the guys are today, I mean, they're up there. They get a 2-strike count. They're trying to hit one out still, and there is a tremendous amount of strikeouts where guys like you know, Jimmie Foxx and DiMaggio and Greenberg. I mean, you know, back in that era, you know, you didn't want to strike out. I mean, that was a badge of honor that you would protect the plate. And you know, a guy with Fox's strength, he wasn't trying to hit one out with a 2-strike count. I'm sure he just wanted to put the ball in play.
Well, Fox did lead the American League in strikeouts quite a few times, but the numbers were so different, and that's what you're alluding to here, I think. And
yeah, it's the ratio of strikeouts to home runs, right?
Right. Yep. He struck out 70 times in 1929, and that might have led the American League if this.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, he led the league in strikeouts. I have his reference page here in front of me. I just went into that. He led the league in strikeouts 7 times, and he struck out 1,311 times with 534 home runs. But,
Alan, you've ruined my image of you.
Okay,
I thought you had it all in your head.
No, not this stuff. And he led in OBP 3 times. He led in slugging 5 times. He led in OPS 5 times. He led in total bases 3 times. Twice with over 400 total bases.
Wow.
Right. And he led in walks, bases on balls twice, I think, and
twice,
bases on balls.
He had more base on balls than strikeouts. They had 1,452 bases on balls.
And he and Gary both had on-base percentages that were quite a bit higher than DiMaggio, Joe, because they walked a lot more than Joe did.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure when DiMaggio came up to the Yankees in 1936, he took a lot of luster away from Fox.
Right. He certainly did. I wanted to tell you guys about one quote from Ted Williams. I did get a letter from Ted Williams early on in the project about 1990. And back then, if you wrote a letter to the Hall of Fame and had them be your gatekeeper, players often felt more comfortable, at least players with a name who were being harassed a lot or pestered a lot about projects like these. So it went through the Hall of Fame to Ted, and he wrote back to me, and he said, I saw only one other player who made the bat in baseball sound like it did when he really hit one, and that guy was Mickey Mantle. So at least during Ted's career, he only had those two to measure up to as far as the comparison of that sound. He really thought they were similar in that way, and I imagine they probably were with their power.
Well, I believe Ted Williams. If he said it, it's true.
And Mickey Mantle was certainly another tape measure home run kind of guy. So,
right.
And really,
now, Mark, let me ask you this about Jimmie Foxx. Have you followed when you said you started to get interested with him up in Boston? But did you get back in and talk to a lot of people in Philadelphia? Because I'm just curious. The reason I'm asking that because some of Fox's greatest years were those years with the A's.
Well, I hit a tough situation, as you can imagine, because when I started the project late in 1989 to do the book on Jimmie Foxx, he would have been 82, but he passed away when he was 59. Right. So right away we've lost the main guy, the character of the book, Jimmie Foxx. But not only that, a lot of his teammates from, say, 1928 to 35, while he was there with the A's, were already passed away. Right. Now, some of the lesser-known players on the A's, and one that comes to mind is Edwin Dibrell Williams, helped me out quite a bit, and I can't remember off the top of my head some of the other Philadelphia A's lesser-known players that gave me some information on Jimmie, but there was a scarcity of a player like Al Simmons or Muehlhaus or Mickey Cochran or somebody like that to talk to. A little bit better when it came to 1936 through 42, his Red Sox years, as far as players that were still alive that I could talk with or get a letter from, like a Dom DiMaggio or someone like that. But
right.
I had to rely a lot on newspaper accounts more than I wanted to for the Philadelphia years.
Well, the reason I was asking you that, Mark, because with my dad, Jimmie and my father were very close friends, but I recall as a youngster hearing my dad talk about Jimmie Foxx, and then I started to do some research as I got older. And, those A's teams, 29, 30, 31, I mean, they won World Series twice, and they won the American League pennant 3 times consecutively. And they had those great players. Connie Mack eventually had to sell them and trade them to make some money. But he had Mickey Cochran and Al Simmons and Lefty Grove and Jimmie Foxx all in that starting lineup. And the A's were a tremendously powerful team, stronger, many people say even a better team than the 27 Murderers Row Yankees.
Yeah, one of the things that hurt Connie Mack very badly is that Pennsylvania didn't allow Sunday baseball until 1934.
Right.
Which by that time he had gotten rid of almost everybody.
Right.
And it hurt him throughout his, the team that he had also in the teens. They couldn't play on Sundays. They lost a tremendous amount of money because of that. I think Pennsylvania was the last state that was in the major leagues at that time to lift the ban on Sunday games. But that was a big problem.
That's right.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Alan. That was they called them the Sunday Blue Laws.
Yeah,
and,
right.
That's what Pennsylvania was. I mean, they banned a lot of stuff going on Sundays. It just was part of the culture of the city. But that obviously changed. But that was you're absolutely right. I think that was certainly a detriment to the guys playing for the A's because of the fact that not being able to play on Sundays historically had been a detriment to the athletes. So one other thing I wanted to ask you, Mark, if you could, talk a little bit about Jimmie, not the ball player, but you mentioned about not having a college degree, and he certainly had some financial difficulties toward the end of his life. I'd like you to touch upon it a little bit because I think it's a lesson to be learned about a lot of ball players. More ball players today have, they have advisors and financial consultants and all kinds of things and long-term contracts. But, when it comes to the players, I think Jimmie Foxx, if he retired in 1945, I don't think he was covered at all by the pension plan.
I know. I covered that in the book briefly, and I think he missed out on the pension plan by a year, but I'd have to go back and check. I think it was something to do with 1946 in that whole story.
Yeah, that's what it was. It was retroactive to 1946. So if he retired in 45 and then he was having some financial problems, you know, he wasn't getting one dime from Major League Baseball. Yeah,
I met Jimmie's nephew, Del Fox III, who is still alive, and he was a banker back in the early 1990s, and he said, gee, could you imagine if Jimmie was making today's salaries and I was his financial advisor, he'd be in great shape.
Right.
But that doesn't answer the question of what really happened with him. In 1941-ish, it was either that year or maybe the year before, during the war, he made some investments that failed down in Florida related to one or more golf courses. The trouble is, later that probably would have been a good investment. It was just made at the wrong time. But again, because he couldn't find, some people say he was hitting the bottle too much, but I've never found anybody that I could talk with who claimed that it changed his judgment or he was a bad person when he was drinking or made bad decisions or was obnoxious or any of that. I just heard he was very gregarious. He did like to have his drinks with friends and family and whatnot and players and that kind of thing. But I think a lot's been made at times by some of the press, like in the 50s and 60s, looking back, trying to say he had problems with drinking. But I've never been convinced that was really the case. He didn't really have an agent that I know of in the late 30s or early 40s as his career was winding down, but his earning power was pretty good there. Probably, I'm going to guess, with Tom Yawkey in 36 through 41, his salary, I think, was getting up there around the 20s or 30,000. I can't remember. I'd have to look. Maybe it's in the book, so to speak. But he was making some pretty good money, but one of his problems, and you guys may have heard this, was he was kind of generous to a fault, and he was a big tipper. And he also liked to pay the bill a lot of times, and he also liked to help out rookies. And so he was letting his money go a little bit too quickly. But
I have a question. Yeah, I have a question, Mark, because in my book, we spend a good bit of time talking about what happened to the players during the war. Some were drafted, some went into the service voluntarily, and others managed to stay out either for medical reason or because they went to work for defense plant in the off season. How did Jimmie Foxx do during those, like 42 through 45? What was he was probably too old for the draft, I would think, but they didn't stop the government from bringing you into a defense plant.
Right. He tried to get in the service and was turned down, and I'm embarrassed to say it's been a while since I've looked at that in the book, but I think I cover that. But unfortunately, I think his career went downhill, as you can see from the numbers, a little quicker than most people thought it would happen. 1942, he was injured a good bit and had sinusitis problems more than in the past. He played in parts of 100 games with the Red Sox and the Cubs. 1943, he was retired for a while or did not play. 1944, he only played 15 games pretty much as a pinch hitter for the Cubs. Then 45, he came back with the Phillies as a part-time player. Is that what you were asking, or?
Yeah. Well, also, as I said, a number of those guys, including George's dad, worked in defense plants in the off season. So I was just curious as to what.
David, I think in Jimmie Foxx's situation, and Mark, you might want to bear me out on this, but it was probably more of age than anything else.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, when my dad was 4F, I mean, he was an active ball player, and he worked in the defense industry because he was declared 4F because of a shoulder injury. So, a lot of the press and fans, they would say, why the hell are you out there on the ball field when you should be on the battlefield? But that's,
right.
That was out of his control. That was part of what, with 4F being declared. And I have to think that Jimmie, if he was younger, I'm sure he would have been called. I'm not sure what his status would have been, but as he aged, I think he was beyond the age of being called up to serve in World War II.
Yeah, I have to say I don't know for sure what happened there.
Right.
I can't shed light on that. But I do know he didn't work in any defense plants during the war.
Right. Now, Mark, I'm assuming also, we talked about the astronomical salaries and long-term contracts and agents and everything else. I'm assuming Jimmie did not have an agent. Very few players ever during that era had an agent, and probably his contracts with the Red Sox were year to year. I don't think he signed anything like a long-term contract with Boston.
Right, I believe they were year to year, but at least with Tom Yawkey, he had a little more of a chance, so to speak, of making something closer to his full potential for that time period. Except for Gehrig and Ruth, it's probably silly for me to even mention Babe Ruth. He was just in a class of his own, but at least Gehrig was playing for the Yankees. They had their coffers were quite a bit better than Connie Mack's. But Jimmie started at the worst time for most ball players. Lou Gehrig may be an exception again because of the Yankees, but being a star player from 1930 to 1939 was not the greatest time to be a ball player. However, saying that, he was certainly a lot better off than a lot of people during the Depression.
Right.
But he didn't have much of a chance to really build up his money the way people do today. But of course, that's a whole different scale.
Well, it is. When you're making tens of millions of dollars, and they get some good investment advice, and make some long-term investments, you don't have to worry about working another day the rest of your life after you retire. Now, I'm sure Jimmie was far from that, and he had to work. He had made some investments that didn't turn out, and it was a sad ending with Jimmie. I believe he was having dinner with his brother Sam, and he choked on a piece of meat and died, which same thing had happened to his wife 2 years before that. The same cause of death, which was incredible, the irony of that. And, it was something that, when I've talked to people about it, they find that that's really hard to believe, but that's actually what happened.
Right. Now, I don't know how many people know or don't know that Jim did divorce in mid-year of 1943. I never saw any money values as far as what Helen, his first wife, got during the divorce, as a result of the divorce proceedings, but I know he was quite happy with his second wife, who he married basically just weeks later, I think in June of 43, Dorothy, and he was married with her until he passed away. He adopted Nancy, her daughter, who I think is still alive, and Nancy was the back girl for the Fort Wayne Daisies back in 52. But Jimmie, I mention this because Jimmie overall, from Nancy's point of view, was quite a bit happier day to day during his latter years than people think he was. So, that's a point of debate, too. How happy or unhappy was he in his final years? Well, he was living in Florida, and for most of those years, he was still golfing quite a bit. He was still seeing a lot of people that he liked to be around. He was happily married. He had a son by his second wife, 2 sons by his first wife, and he had a adopted daughter. I don't know if he adopted her son. But overall, on balance, from what I can tell from the research, he was happier than people think he was. But, yes, he would have liked to have been making more money and had a more stable job.
Right. One other thing I wanted to mention to you, Mark, and you talked, you had my dad included in your book. Jimmie was also a hunter, and the Eastern Shore of Maryland was great goose hunting area. And I think it was my dad and Max Bishop and a couple other ball players. They came to a dinner, and you mentioned in your book they came to a dinner for Jimmie out of respect for Jimmie, but they were still in their hunting clothes. And I'm sure that Jimmie appreciated that because that's what he loved to do. I think, as a matter of fact, my dad and Jimmie might have goose hunted together on the Eastern Shore of Maryland.
Right. And that was probably a dinner roughly in 1940 in Easton, Maryland, that I think was given a large part for Jimmie. The town of Sudlersville in 1929 and 1933 had two large dinners for Jimmie at the end of the season, one in which almost all the Philadelphia A's came, that first one after their first World Series win in 1929, and the other after he won the Triple Crown in 1933. And a lot of the fellas that came to those dinners were also some of the same ones that would barnstorm with him on the Eastern Shore a lot of times in the early 1930s, and also hunt with him frequently on the Eastern Shore in the 1930s.
Well, you know what, Mark? It's something that I'm in this area, and I know the Eastern Shore is very popular. David probably knows a lot more about it, that being down in D.C. But for Alan in Pittsburgh or for Hal in New York City or Ralph.
I'm in New York City. I only went to college there.
Yeah, the Eastern Shore.
Yeah.
Right, the Eastern Shore of Maryland is a mecca for recreation and hunters and that kind of thing. So I wanted to mention that because that was one of my earliest recollections. It was my dad being a duck hunter. He used to always talk about the Eastern Shore, and I think that he and Jimmie had hunted together. They were very friendly, and it was interesting to hear, and that's why, Mark, I was so happy to receive your book because it was a real fun for me to read through that and the names and a lot of people that my dad played with and against and I personally knew. You did a really nice job, and I wanted to congratulate you, and I wanted to thank you for for joining us on this podcast because it was a very nice discussion about Jimmie Foxx, who I think, as we started to say at the beginning, has been overlooked. Certainly one of baseball's greatest players.
Yeah, I was just wondering from your perspective, all of you, on a different note, we had these guys this certain size range. Jimmie Foxx, Mickey Mantle, Ted Williams was taller, of course, not real. Look at the size of these guys now, hitting 40 or 50 home runs a year, and how fast the pitchers are throwing now compared to even 20 years ago. We almost never heard of 100 miles per hour 20 years ago or 98 miles per hour. So, it's going to be harder and harder to compare players from different eras as far as the statistics and everything go as time goes on.
Yeah, I think, Mark, I've said all along, I don't believe that you can really compare eras one to the other. The baseball that was played in the 20s and 30s, totally different game than the baseball is played today. And the players are bigger, faster, stronger. I'm not sure they're as fundamentally sound, but my thinking is that you should compare players of that era to one another.
Right.
So you compare, Fox and Gehrig and Greenberg and Williams and those guys, not comparing them to the great players today because it's a totally different era. And I think that people are trying to compare record holders and all that kind of stuff. But when you have a Babe Ruth, you try not to compare him to somebody today, but Babe Ruth is transcending anybody, and there's probably no name of any player in history more revered than Babe Ruth. But to try to say, hey, Babe Ruth could not hit against a player pitching today 98 or 100 miles an hour, I think is ludicrous because he hit against guys back then but they didn't measure. Walter Johnson and Bob Feller, they didn't measure the speed of their pitches. I mean, today they got radar guns for everybody. But back then, you didn't have it. And if a batter got up there and said, man, that guy's got a heck of a fastball, that's what he had. Or he's got a heck of a curveball. They weren't talking about, off-speed velocity and all this kind of stuff. And what David was talking about at the beginning, all this statistical, we talk about launch angles and escape velocities and all this other stuff. That didn't go on back then.
Can you imagine if they had launch angles and exit velocities when Jimmie Foxx was playing?
Or Babe Ruth.
I'm sure, Alan, it would be amazing. But you know what? We're never going to see it.
I know, even Mickey Mantle. But
well, I can come up with a good title for the book if anybody wants to write it. It's called "Only the Diamond Remains the Same."
Right.
Very good, David. Hey, Mark, thank you very much for joining us.
The proceeding has been a comfortably zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.